In the underworld of New York City, where violence and betrayal were part of daily life, one man rose above it all, Charles "Lucky" Luciano. From his rough immigrant beginnings to becoming the most powerful figure in organized crime, his journey was one of intelligence, manipulation, and ruthless ambition. Luciano didn't just survive the streets, he mastered them, reshaping the mafia into a sophisticated empire. But as his power grew, so did the enemies determined to bring him down. His rise to the top was inevitable, but his fall would prove just how fragile loyalty and power truly are in the world he created. The man who would go on to become the architect of modern organized crime in America was once just another child of the streets. Charles "Lucky" Luciano's rise to power is one of the most extraordinary and complex tales in the annals of criminal history. Born in 1897 in the rough immigrant neighborhoods of New York City, Luciano's story is not just one of ruthless ambition, but of a mind shaped by the harsh realities of a world where survival was a constant battle, and betrayal was inevitable. But it was also a story of reinvention, of seeing the world as it was and daring to reshape it in his own image. It is a story that transcends mere criminality and taps into the very human instincts of power, loyalty, and self-preservation. Luciano's meteoric rise didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of an unyielding desire for control over his own destiny. As a child of Sicilian immigrants, he learned early on that power in America wasn't given, it was taken. He grew up in the Lower East Side, an area notorious for its ethnic enclaves, where the sense of community was often more about survival than camaraderie. The streets were ruled by ethnic gangs that, in their struggle for power, embodied the brutality and lawlessness that would come to define organized crime in the early 20th century. Luciano was no stranger to this world. In fact, it was within these tight-knit, violent circles that he first encountered the mafia's code, a code that would govern his life and form the backbone of his criminal empire. Yet, unlike many of his peers who rose through sheer violence, Luciano had something different in mind. He understood that to survive and ultimately to thrive, he had to become something more than just a street thug. He needed to master the system, to control the very forces that governed the criminal underworld. As a young man, Luciano was shrewd and ambitious, but also deeply pragmatic. He was never a man driven by idealism. For him, power was a tool, something to be wielded and manipulated. In the rough, anarchic world of early 20th century organized crime, there were no formal rules, only the ever-present shadow of law enforcement and the internal power struggles within the Italian-American mafia. Luciano's genius lay not just in his ability to build alliances, but in his understanding that the mafia needed to evolve. Where others saw a collection of feuding gangs, Luciano saw a fragmented empire in desperate need of organization and structure. He understood that the old ways of operating, relying on violence, chaos, and unpredictability, would eventually crumble under the weight of their own recklessness. What Luciano brought to the table was a vision of a unified mafia, operating with the precision of a business rather than a collection of rival factions. This vision, however, would not come without cost. As Luciano rose through the ranks, he faced constant challenges from both outside and within. The streets were filled with potential rivals, men who had their own ambitions and saw Luciano's rise as a threat to their own power. His own survival was dependent on outsmarting these men, as well as the city's growing law enforcement presence. During this time, Luciano honed his skills in negotiation, manipulation, and the art of deception. He wasn't just a man of action, he was a man of strategy. He carefully selected his allies, knowing full well that loyalty in the mafia was often more fragile than it appeared. But he also understood the value of fear, and how it could be used as a tool to keep his enemies at bay. Luciano never hesitated to employ violence when necessary, but his true strength lay in his ability to stay one step ahead of his opponents. He didn't need to be the strongest man on the block, he needed to be the smartest. As he began to consolidate power, Luciano realized that his vision of a unified mafia would require more than just defeating rivals. It would require creating a system that could withstand the forces arrayed against it. So he did what few others had the foresight to do. He started organizing. Rather than relying on brute force alone, Luciano set about building an infrastructure, a hierarchy that would allow the mafia to operate efficiently and profitably. It was a ruthless and Machiavellian approach, but it was also incredibly effective. Through his dealings in bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and extortion, Luciano turned the mafia into a true enterprise, one that could compete with legitimate businesses. He was a pioneer in organizing crime, applying business principles to an illegal world. At the same time, Luciano's rise was shaped by the larger forces at play in American society. The 1920s were a time of immense social change, with prohibition serving as the perfect storm for organized crime. The national ban on alcohol opened up massive opportunities for those who were willing to break the law. But it was also a time of increased law enforcement efforts, as the federal government sought to combat the growing power of organized crime. The tension between these two forces, the rising tide of criminal enterprise and the government's response, created a volatile environment in which Luciano's genius would be tested. In the face of growing federal pressure, Luciano's ability to navigate the legal system and outmaneuver his enemies became even more critical. Luciano's leadership was also shaped by his relationships with other key figures in the world of organized crime. Men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and Albert Anastasia would become some of Luciano's most trusted allies, but these relationships were never straightforward. Loyalty in the mafia was always a fragile thing, and even the strongest alliances could be shattered by betrayal. Luciano, however, understood this better than anyone. He was always aware of the need to control his allies, just as much as he controlled his enemies. He was a man who knew that trust had to be earned, and even then it was never absolute. The mafia was a world built on deception, and Luciano's ability to play the game of loyalty and betrayal was unmatched. By the time Luciano had reached the apex of his power, he had created a criminal empire that was more sophisticated and far-reaching than anything the world had ever seen. But the very success that had elevated him to such heights would also bring about his eventual downfall. Luciano's rise was a testament to his intelligence, ambition, and ruthlessness. But it was also a reminder that in the world of organized crime, power was always fleeting, and the cost of success was often higher than anyone could imagine. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just one of crime and power, it is the story of a man who, through sheer will and cunning, transformed the criminal world. But it is also the story of the inevitable consequences of that ambition, how the very systems he created to consolidate power would ultimately lead to his undoing. As we begin this journey into the rise and fall of one of history's most notorious figures, we are left with one haunting question. What is the price of ambition, and is it ever truly worth it? Before Lucky Luciano became the mastermind behind the rise of the American Mafia, the world of organized crime in America was a fragmented, chaotic web of competing factions. There was no unified structure, no clear rules of engagement, and certainly no central authority. The underworld was a battleground, where power was seized by force and loyalty was a fleeting commodity, always susceptible to betrayal. The Italian-American Mafia, in particular, was divided into rival gangs, each vying for control of different territories, whether it was for bootlegging, gambling, or the extortion of businesses. The world Luciano entered was one where allegiances were constantly shifting, and the only certainty was that survival required cunning, strength, and the ability to strike swiftly and decisively. In the early years of the 20th century, the mafia was a collection of loose, independent factions. There was no single criminal organization governing all Italian-American crime families. Instead, there were many competing groups, each with its own leadership and its own territories. The most notable among these were the Neapolitan and Sicilian factions, who had been involved in various forms of criminal activity in New York for decades. These groups operated with little coordination, constantly engaged in turf wars, petty squabbles, and power struggles. Each family had its own set of rules, and trust between factions was virtually non-existent. Rivalry between the Sicilian and Neapolitan factions was particularly fierce, with each side claiming dominance over different areas of the city. This was a world of fractured power, where the ability to control territory was more important than any notion of loyalty or unity. During this period, the mafia operated mostly in the shadows, relying on violence, intimidation, and the exploitation of vices like gambling, prostitution, and bootlegging to generate revenue. The illegal alcohol trade during Prohibition was a huge source of income, but it also brought the mafia into direct conflict with law enforcement and other criminal organizations. While many of the gangs were involved in this trade, there was no sense of cooperation or organization. Instead, each faction sought to control its own piece of the action, often clashing violently with others who stood in the way. The absence of a central figure to unite these fractured factions left the underworld in a constant state of instability, where power was tenuous and shifting at the whims of gang leaders and street thugs. It was in this climate of disarray and lawlessness that Luciano first made his mark. The streets of New York City were a breeding ground for crime, where violence was common and the law was often powerless to stop it. In neighborhoods like the Lower East Side, where Luciano grew up, gangs fought for control of local businesses and organized crime flourished unchecked. But it wasn't just the petty criminals and street thugs who made their mark in this chaotic world. Powerful men from the old world criminal organizations such as the Sicilian Mafia were also active, and their influence was far-reaching. The Italian-American Mafia was already a powerful force in certain parts of the city, but it lacked the unity and structure to truly dominate the underworld. This is where Luciano saw an opportunity to consolidate power, unite the fragmented factions, and build an empire that would endure. What Luciano realized early on was that the Mafia's disorganized structure was both a weakness and an opportunity. While many of the gang leaders were content to operate independently, focusing on their own profits and power, Luciano saw the potential for greater success through unity. He understood that the constant infighting between families was not only inefficient but also dangerous. It made the Mafia vulnerable to outside threats, including law enforcement and rival gangs. If he could bring together the warring factions, he could create an empire that was far more powerful than anything that existed at the time. But Luciano's ambition was not driven solely by a desire for power. He understood that in order to truly control the Mafia, he had to break away from the traditional ways of doing things. The Mafia of the early 1900s was governed by a code of silence and loyalty known as omerta. While this code had been effective in maintaining secrecy and order within the underworld, it also created a system where power was concentrated in the hands of a few individuals, and loyalty was often maintained at any cost. Luciano, however, saw this as a weakness. He realized that loyalty, while essential, could not be the only factor governing the Mafia's operations. He understood that in order to build a lasting empire, he needed to create a structure that was both profitable and sustainable, one that could adapt to changing circumstances. One of the critical elements of this vision was Luciano's ability to think like a businessman. He wasn't interested in the chaotic, short-term gains that defined much of the Mafia's activities. Instead, he sought to turn crime into a highly organized, profitable enterprise. He understood that in order to achieve this, he needed to create a system that could generate consistent revenue and protect his interests. Gambling, bootlegging, and labor racketeering were all lucrative businesses, but they were also highly competitive. The Mafia was already involved in these enterprises, but Luciano sought to streamline the process, creating a more efficient way of operating. To achieve this, Luciano began to form alliances with key figures in the Mafia. He knew that in order to unite the fractured factions, he needed to form a coalition of powerful men who could help him execute his vision. The first step in this process was to gain the trust of the various family leaders, particularly those who controlled the most profitable operations. Luciano knew that in the cutthroat world of organized crime, power could not be achieved without making deals, and those deals had to be carefully negotiated. By forming strategic alliances with other gang leaders, Luciano was able to solidify his position and begin uniting the different factions. At the same time, Luciano also recognized the need for secrecy and discretion. In a world where betrayal was always a possibility, he had to ensure that his moves remained hidden from his enemies. Unlike other mobsters who relied on brute force to get what they wanted, Luciano used his intelligence and cunning to stay one step ahead of those who might threaten him. He built a network of informants, carefully cultivating relationships with key figures in both the criminal world and law enforcement. By doing so, he was able to gather valuable intelligence and protect himself from the constant threats that surrounded him. As Luciano's influence grew, so too did the sense of powerlessness among the rival factions. The other gang leaders began to realize that Luciano's vision was more than just a passing trend. His ability to unite the fragmented Mafia families, while simultaneously expanding into new areas of illegal activity, made him an increasingly formidable figure. The established order in the underworld was being disrupted, and the old guard was beginning to feel the weight of Luciano's ambition. The war between the rival factions escalated, and Luciano knew that in order to truly cement his position, he would need to eliminate any threats to his authority. This period marked the beginning of the transformation of the Mafia from a loose network of independent groups into a well-oiled criminal machine. The fragmentation that had previously defined the world of organized crime was slowly being replaced by a centralized system, one where Luciano was at the top. This shift would ultimately change the very nature of the Mafia, turning it from a chaotic, violent collection of gangs into a powerful and profitable empire that operated with the precision of a legitimate business. But this transformation didn't come without its struggles. There were constant threats to Luciano's rule, both from within the Mafia and from external forces, including law enforcement and rival criminal organizations. It was a constant battle, and Luciano had to use every ounce of his cunning and strategic thinking to stay ahead of his enemies. In this world of constant upheaval, Luciano's rise to power was nothing short of extraordinary. While other gangsters focused on immediate gains and short-term power, Luciano's vision was always focused on the long term. He understood that in order to truly control the underworld, he needed to build something more lasting than just a fleeting empire. Through his intelligence, manipulation, and strategic alliances, Luciano was able to reshape the mafia, turning it into an organized force that could rival even the most powerful legitimate businesses of the day. This was the world that Luciano inherited, and it was in this environment of power struggles, shifting alliances, and fragile trust that he would rise to become the most influential mob boss in American history. Charles "Lucky" Luciano's early life was anything but ordinary. Born on November 24, 1897, in the heart of the slums of New York City, his beginnings were steeped in hardship, and it was within this environment that his character was forged. Luciano was the son of Italian immigrants, a background that would come to define his life and career. His father, a poor fisherman, and his mother, who struggled to make ends meet, were part of the massive influx of Italians who arrived in the United States at the turn of the century. The immigrant experience was one of survival, and in a city like New York, where the streets were a battleground for control and resources, this survival often meant engaging in some form of illegal activity. From a young age, Luciano understood that in order to thrive in this new world, he had to be tougher, smarter, and more resourceful than anyone else. The tenement buildings of the Lower East Side, where Luciano grew up, were a crucible for the young boy. The neighborhood was teeming with immigrants, many of whom faced the same struggles that his family did. However, the struggle for survival was often compounded by the crime and violence that were rampant in the area. Gangs ruled the streets, and while most residents were simply trying to make a living, the criminal underworld was never far away. Luciano's exposure to this world at a tender age shaped his worldview and set him on a path that would later lead him to become one of the most infamous and powerful mobsters in American history. Luciano's early education was far from conventional. He didn't attend school regularly, and when he did, it was often to learn how to navigate the streets rather than the classroom. The lessons he picked up from his environment were the most valuable of all. From his earliest years, Luciano learned the art of survival. In the slums, a show of weakness was as dangerous as any criminal act. Luciano quickly became accustomed to the harsh realities of life. He learned how to read people, how to gain their trust, and, more importantly, how to manipulate them. These lessons would be the foundation of his later success. The first taste of power came to Luciano when he was still a teenager. At the age of 14, he was already running small hustles on the streets, engaging in petty crime like pickpocketing and selling stolen goods. However, he soon found that such small-scale crime didn't offer the kind of power or influence that he craved. Luciano's mind, ever calculating and ambitious, turned to more lucrative avenues. He began to understand that true power wasn't just about petty theft. It was about controlling the systems that allowed crime to flourish. In his mind, the mafia, despite its chaotic nature at the time, held the keys to a far more substantial empire, and Luciano's future lay in aligning himself with that power. At just 17 years old, Luciano's life took a pivotal turn. He was arrested for the first time in his life, but rather than shaking his resolve, the experience only seemed to cement his determination. He wasn't intimidated by the police, nor did he fear the consequences of his actions. In fact, he quickly learned to play the game of law enforcement and criminal justice. Luciano's early brushes with the law taught him a crucial lesson. The police, the courts, and the politicians were just part of a much larger system of power, and it was a system that he would need to master in order to rise to the top. Luciano wasn't simply a street thug. He had a vision, one that went far beyond petty crime or even the traditional operations of the mafia. As he matured, he began to see crime not as a series of disconnected acts of violence but as a business. His growing ambition turned him into a young man obsessed with structure and organization. By the time he was in his early 20s, Luciano had already set himself apart from many of the older, more traditional mafia members. He saw the potential to organize the criminal world in a way that would mirror a legitimate business. It was during this time that Luciano became closely associated with the notorious gangster, Arnold Rothstein, one of the most influential figures in New York's underworld. Rothstein was a man who could move within the highest echelons of society while simultaneously running the most illicit operations. He was also one of the first to recognize Luciano's talents. It was under Rothstein's mentorship that Luciano learned the importance of business acumen in criminal enterprises. Rothstein was a gambler, a fixer, and a schemer, and he taught Luciano the finer points of managing crime as an organized business. Rothstein's influence on Luciano cannot be overstated. He instilled in the young man the concept of long-term strategy, patience, and careful planning. By the time Luciano reached his mid-20s, his understanding of the underworld had grown exponentially. He wasn't content to simply be a part of the mafia. He aimed to dominate it. The world that Luciano found himself in was full of ambition, but it was also filled with competition. The five families, the powerful mafia factions that controlled New York's crime scene, were all at war with one another, each vying for control of the city's most lucrative illegal operations. In this world there was no room for error. Luciano, however, had learned that there was a way to rise above the rest. He would not fight in the same way that the mafia bosses before him had. He would play the game differently. It was at this point that Luciano's involvement with some of the most notorious names in the mafia began to grow. He became a trusted member of the Genovese family, one of the most influential of the five families. As he rose through the ranks, his strategic mind began to take shape. Luciano wasn't a man who relied on brute force to get ahead. He wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but he was undoubtedly one of the smartest. He knew that in order to truly control the mafia, he had to get the different factions to cooperate, something that no one had ever successfully done before. As his reputation grew, Luciano's leadership qualities became more and more apparent. He wasn't content to simply be a part of the system. He wanted to overhaul it. The mafia had operated in a fragmented way for decades, with each family looking out for its own interests, and the various factions constantly at war with each other. Luciano, with his sharp mind and natural charisma, saw an opportunity to change that. He realized that if he could unite the mafia families, he could create a far more powerful criminal enterprise, one that could control everything from gambling and bootlegging to unions and even labor strikes. He saw the potential to build an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. The turning point in Luciano's life came when he made a key alliance with two other influential figures in the mafia, Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. These men would become his trusted allies in his quest to restructure the mafia. Together, the trio began working toward a plan to consolidate power and eliminate their rivals. Luciano understood the importance of control, and he used his alliances strategically to position himself as the power behind the throne. But it wasn't just his alliance building that set Luciano apart. It was his ability to think long-term. While other gangsters were focused on immediate rewards, Luciano had his eyes set on creating a legacy. He wasn't interested in short-term gains. He wanted to build something that would last. His understanding of the mafia as an organized enterprise, combined with his strategic alliances, laid the groundwork for the powerful criminal syndicate that would eventually be known as the Commission, the governing body that oversaw all of the mafia's activities in the United States. Luciano's rise from a poor street kid to the leader of the most powerful criminal organization in the world was no accident. It was the result of years of carefully calculated decisions, relationships forged in blood, and a vision that would change the course of American criminal history forever. Through sheer willpower and intellect, Luciano became a figure whose name would become synonymous with the mafia. His ambition, intelligence, and ability to manipulate the people around him made him one of the most formidable figures the world of organized crime had ever seen. The foundations of his empire were laid early on, in the streets of New York, in the back alleys and dark corners where he learned the most important lessons of all: how to survive, how to dominate, and how to become the most powerful man in the room. From these humble beginnings, Luciano would go on to build an empire that would forever alter the landscape of organized crime. His legacy would be one of power, control, and ruthless ambition. But it was also a legacy of transformation, the story of a man who, through sheer cunning and drive, reshaped the very system he entered, and in doing so became the architect of the modern mafia. By the time Luciano had established himself as a force to be reckoned with in New York's underworld, the city's mafia was still a fractured, disjointed network of rival factions. Each of the five families, the Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families, operated independently, often at odds with one another. Their operations were inefficient and lacked coordination, and while they controlled much of New York's illegal activities, they also constantly fought amongst themselves for dominance. Luciano saw this disarray not as a challenge but as an opportunity. If he could consolidate these fragmented gangs, if he could unite them under one banner, then he could build something far greater than any of the mafia families had ever achieved. What Luciano envisioned was not simply a more powerful mafia, but an entirely new structure, a criminal empire built on the principles of business and organization. This was the moment that Luciano began to craft his empire, and it was during this period that his genius truly began to unfold. Luciano was not merely a street-level thug. He was a visionary who saw organized crime as a business, a lucrative enterprise that could be run more efficiently than any legitimate company. He recognized that the key to success was not just in controlling territory, but in managing operations and making them profitable. He understood that the mafia was more than a loose collection of families. It was an institution that could be structured, run with discipline, and organized in a way that would make it more powerful than anything that had come before it. To achieve this vision, Luciano first needed to eliminate the infighting and chaos that plagued the mafia. The old guard, with its territorial disputes and lack of cohesion, was standing in the way of progress. Luciano's first task was to unite the rival families, to form alliances that would end the constant bickering and establish a level of cooperation that had never existed before. He began by forging relationships with key figures in each of the families, including Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and others who were as hungry for power as he was. These alliances were essential in Luciano's plan to bring the mafia under one roof, and they would play a pivotal role in the creation of the Commission, the governing body that would eventually oversee the mafia's operations throughout the United States. While the creation of the Commission was a crucial part of Luciano's vision, it was only one element of his larger plan to structure the mafia as a cohesive, efficient organization. The real innovation came in Luciano's approach to the mafia's activities. He understood that crime, like any other business, needed to be organized in a way that maximized profits and minimized risks. One of his first moves was to introduce a system of specialization within the mafia. Rather than each family acting independently and competing for the same resources, Luciano created a division of labor. Different families would control different aspects of the mafia's business. One family might focus on bootlegging, while another specialized in gambling, extortion, or labor racketeering. This division of labor allowed the mafia to operate like a well-oiled machine, with each family responsible for a specific area of criminal activity. But Luciano didn't stop there. He understood that the key to maintaining control over such a sprawling operation was to build a system that could handle the day-to-day operations of the mafia while keeping the leadership insulated from the dangers of street-level violence and law enforcement. He established a hierarchy within the mafia, with a clear chain of command. At the top was the boss, who held the ultimate authority. Beneath him were the underbosses, who were responsible for overseeing the activities of the various families and ensuring that the business ran smoothly. Beneath them were the captains, soldiers, and associates who carried out the day-to-day work of the mafia. This hierarchy allowed the mafia to function efficiently, with each level of the organization having its own specific duties and responsibilities. The creation of this hierarchical structure was critical to Luciano's success. It allowed him to maintain control over the entire organization without having to micromanage every aspect of its operations. Each family and each member of the mafia had a specific role, and each role contributed to the overall success of the organization. This structure also allowed Luciano to avoid the infighting that had previously plagued the mafia. Because each family had its own area of responsibility, there was less competition and fewer disputes over territory. The focus was now on making money, and making money was something Luciano was particularly adept at. Luciano's understanding of business didn't just extend to the structure of the mafia, it also influenced how he approached the operations themselves. One of his most significant contributions was his ability to turn criminal enterprises into profitable, sustainable businesses. During Prohibition, when the sale of alcohol was banned, Luciano recognized that the demand for alcohol was not going away. In fact, it was increasing. The potential profits from bootlegging were astronomical, but it required organization, logistics, and management. Luciano didn't just see bootlegging as a way to make quick money, he saw it as an ongoing business venture. He established smuggling routes, coordinated with suppliers, and developed distribution networks. He treated the operation like a legitimate business, ensuring that it ran smoothly and that profits were maximized. The success of this operation was a testament to Luciano's ability to think like a businessman rather than a mere gangster. But it wasn't just bootlegging that Luciano saw as a business opportunity. He also understood the value of other illegal activities, including gambling, extortion, and even the control of labor unions. These were not just ways to make money, they were ways to build a long-term criminal empire. Luciano's ability to see the larger picture, to recognize the interconnectedness of these various operations, allowed him to create an empire that spanned across multiple industries. Whether it was controlling the numbers rackets, running illegal casinos, or organizing strikes for unionized workers, Luciano's influence touched nearly every aspect of New York City's underground economy. Perhaps Luciano's most significant contribution to organized crime, however, was his ability to navigate the world of politics and law enforcement. In the cutthroat world of the mafia, political connections were often just as important as the ability to control the streets. Luciano knew that in order to protect his empire, he needed to ensure that the law was on his side. He forged relationships with corrupt politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials, ensuring that his operations were shielded from the scrutiny of the authorities. He also understood the importance of bribery, coercion, and manipulation in dealing with politicians and law enforcement. Luciano's ability to navigate this world, to buy influence and keep the law at bay, was one of the reasons he was able to rise to such power. By the time Luciano had fully consolidated his power, the mafia was no longer just a collection of independent gangs, it was a unified, highly organized criminal empire. The commission which Luciano had helped to create was the governing body that oversaw all of the mafia's operations in the United States. The families were now working together, each with their own territories and areas of business, but all answering to Luciano. He had not only built an empire, he had created a system that was efficient, profitable, and sustainable. The mafia was now a business in every sense of the word, and Luciano was its CEO. Through his vision, leadership, and innovation, Luciano had changed the face of organized crime in America. He had taken a chaotic, fragmented underworld and transformed it into a well-structured empire. But this empire was not just built on power, it was built on intelligence, strategy, and the ability to think like a businessman. Luciano's reign marked the beginning of a new era for the mafia, one that would continue to thrive for decades, even after his downfall. His ability to organize, to unify, and to turn crime into a business was his legacy, and it was a legacy that would inspire generations of criminals to come. In the criminal world, loyalty is often regarded as the most sacred of virtues. The mafia, with its intricate web of power, influence, and secrecy, relies heavily on the bonds of loyalty that connect its members. But loyalty in the mafia is a complex and multifaceted concept. It is both a shield and a weapon, something that protects the family from external threats, yet something that can also be used to control and manipulate the very people who pledge their allegiance. For Lucky Luciano, the concept of loyalty was central not only to his rise to power but to the very foundation of the criminal empire he would build. It was loyalty that allowed him to unite the fractured mafia families, but it was also loyalty that would prove to be one of the most dangerous forces in his world. The mafia's code of silence, known as omerta, is perhaps the most well-known aspect of its loyalty structure. Omerta dictates that members of the mafia are bound by an unspoken vow of silence. To break this code is to betray not only the family but the entire organization, with consequences that are often fatal. This code is one of the cornerstones of mafia culture, and it is designed to protect the secrecy and integrity of the organization. Omerta ensures that the law enforcement and the outside world are kept at bay, preventing anyone from infiltrating the inner workings of the mafia. The fear of retribution for breaking omerta is so ingrained that even the mere suggestion of betrayal is enough to strike terror into the hearts of those within the organization. For Luciano, omerta was more than just a rule to follow, it was a tool to control and manipulate the loyalty of his allies and associates. He understood that loyalty was the currency by which power was exchanged in the mafia. A man's loyalty to the family was his most valuable asset, and it was something that Luciano knew how to exploit to his advantage. Through his strategic alliances, Luciano was able to build a network of loyal followers who would do anything to protect his interests. But loyalty in Luciano's world was never absolute. It was always conditional, always tied to power. In the mafia, loyalty could be bought, traded, and even discarded if it no longer served a purpose. One of the key ways Luciano maintained loyalty was through the establishment of a hierarchy within the mafia. In Luciano's world, power was distributed carefully and deliberately. At the top of the hierarchy sat the boss, the ultimate authority in the family. Beneath him were the underbosses, captains, and soldiers, each with their own specific duties and responsibilities. This structure ensured that loyalty was maintained through a clear chain of command. Each level of the organization had a vested interest in the success of the family, and loyalty to the boss was seen as a necessary part of this system. But loyalty to the boss was not just about obedience, it was about respect and fear. In Luciano's case, he understood that loyalty was not just a matter of following orders. It was a matter of keeping the family's interests at the forefront, of ensuring that everyone in the organization understood their role and the consequences of failing to fulfill it. Loyalty to the family was also reinforced through the concept of reciprocity. In the mafia, loyalty was often a two-way street. The boss or higher-ranking members of the family would provide protection, resources, and opportunities for those who proved their loyalty. In return, Those who benefited from the family's protection were expected to offer their unwavering loyalty in return. This system created a bond that was both practical and psychological. The mafia offered a sense of belonging, of camaraderie to its members, and in return, its members were expected to be loyal, not just because of fear but because of the sense of brotherhood that was forged through shared experiences and mutual benefit. However, loyalty in the mafia was never without its flaws. The very system that Luciano created, one built on loyalty, respect, and fear, was also a breeding ground for distrust, betrayal, and manipulation. While loyalty to the family was paramount, it was also fragile. The dynamics within the mafia were constantly shifting, and the line between loyalty and betrayal was often blurred. Power struggles, personal ambitions, and greed all played a part in undermining the loyalty that was supposed to bind the organization together. Luciano, a man who understood the fragility of loyalty better than most, was keenly aware that the very bonds that held his empire together could also bring it crashing down. One of the most significant tests of loyalty in the mafia came from within the organization itself. It was one thing to be loyal to the boss, but it was another thing entirely to remain loyal when the power structure was threatened. In the cutthroat world of organized crime, loyalty could be tested in ways that were not immediately apparent. Betrayal within the ranks could come in many forms, from an underboss seeking to undermine the boss to a captain who secretly plotted to take control of a family. These threats were constant, and the loyalty of Luciano's closest allies was always in question. His ability to manage these threats, to keep his inner circle loyal while simultaneously expanding his influence, was one of the hallmarks of his leadership. At times, Luciano was forced to make difficult decisions that would test his own loyalty to his men. Loyalty in Luciano's world was not a one-way street. While he expected absolute loyalty from his subordinates, he was also willing to reward loyalty in kind. But loyalty was never guaranteed. Even the most trusted members of the family could become a liability if their actions threatened the organization's interests. Luciano understood that loyalty was a commodity to be used, discarded, or even betrayed when it no longer served his purposes. This harsh reality was something that his closest allies, men like Vito Genovese, Frank Costello, and others, understood well. They knew that loyalty to Luciano was not just about devotion. It was about survival in an environment where only the strongest, most calculating individuals could thrive. Yet, Luciano's approach to loyalty was not purely transactional. There were moments when loyalty transcended the mere desire for power. The mafia was a world steeped in a sense of tradition, and for many of its members, loyalty was a deeply ingrained value. Men like Luciano understood that loyalty was not just about controlling others. It was about creating a culture where loyalty was seen as a sacred bond, one that was forged through years of shared experiences, trust, and respect. It was this sense of loyalty that allowed Luciano to form strong, lasting alliances with men who would follow him through thick and thin, even when the odds were stacked against them. At the same time, loyalty could also be a source of manipulation. Luciano was a master of playing on the emotions and desires of his subordinates. He understood that loyalty was not just about blind obedience, it was about understanding the psychology of the people around him. Luciano knew how to make his men feel valued, how to cultivate loyalty through small gestures of generosity or respect. He knew that loyalty could be manipulated to create a sense of dependence, a feeling that a man owed everything to the family and to its boss. This manipulation was often subtle, yet it was highly effective. Luciano understood the human psyche better than most, and he knew that loyalty could be a tool for control as much as it was a virtue. Loyalty within the mafia also had a dark side. While loyalty could be a source of strength, it could also be a source of vulnerability. The same loyalty that bound the family together could also lead to its undoing. Betrayal in the mafia often came from those closest to the boss. Those who felt slighted, those who saw an opportunity to rise to power, or those who simply wanted to break free from the constraints of the organization. For Luciano, this was a constant threat, and his ability to navigate the delicate balance between loyalty and betrayal was one of the reasons he was able to maintain control for so long. In the end, loyalty in the mafia was not just a principle, it was a weapon, a tool for manipulation, and a psychological construct that allowed leaders like Luciano to maintain control over their empire. It was a bond that held the mafia together, but it was also a force that could fracture and destroy the very organization it was meant to protect. Luciano's understanding of loyalty, both as a virtue and a weapon, allowed him to build a criminal empire that was both formidable and fragile, a reflection of the complex, dangerous world in which he lived. The business of crime is a paradox. It is driven by illegality and chaos, Yet it thrives on the same principles of organization, efficiency, and profit that govern legitimate enterprises. For someone like Lucky Luciano, the understanding of crime as a business was the key to his rise to power and the ultimate transformation of the mafia into a well-oiled, multifaceted criminal empire. The ability to turn chaos into order, to structure criminal activity in a way that maximized profits while minimizing risks, was not only a revolutionary concept for the mafia but also one of Luciano's defining innovations. Through his vision, the underworld ceased to be a mere collection of illegal operations. It became a sophisticated network of businesses, each contributing to the larger goal of domination and wealth. His understanding of the business of crime was what would allow him to take control of vast territories and illicit enterprises across New York, and eventually the entire United States. Luciano's early forays into the criminal world had been driven by simple street-level hustles, pickpocketing, theft, and running small cons. But he quickly realized that such petty crimes were not the pathway to lasting power. To amass real wealth and influence, the mafia needed to evolve into something much more sophisticated. The chaotic nature of the underworld needed to be replaced with order, and the fragmented, competing families needed to be united into a single cohesive entity. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to see crime through the lens of business, recognizing that what the mafia lacked was a central authority, a vision, and an efficient structure. He wanted to take the raw materials of organized crime, gambling, smuggling, prostitution, and labor racketeering, and turn them into legitimate businesses that would function with the precision of any Fortune 500 company. The first area Luciano sought to revolutionize was bootlegging. The Prohibition era, which outlawed the sale and distribution of alcohol in the United States, had created an enormous demand for illegal liquor. While many criminal organizations were involved in bootlegging, the operation was disorganized, and each family fought for control of different smuggling routes and distribution networks. Luciano saw an opportunity to consolidate power and eliminate competition. He understood that bootlegging was not just about smuggling alcohol, it was about distribution, logistics, and, most importantly, control. He worked tirelessly to secure the best routes for importing alcohol, set up a vast network of speakeasies to sell it, and ensured that his organization would dominate the market. Luciano's approach was not simply to smuggle alcohol and sell it at a profit. He structured the entire operation in such a way that it was as efficient and profitable as any legitimate business. He created a supply chain from the importation of alcohol to the final sale, and ensured that each step was carefully controlled. He set up an extensive network of trusted individuals at every level, from the drivers who transported the alcohol to the bartenders who served it in the speakeasies. These operations were so well organized that they often ran smoother than legal businesses of the time. Luciano's innovation lay in transforming the chaotic world of bootlegging into an organized and profitable enterprise that could generate wealth on a massive scale. But bootlegging was just one piece of the puzzle. Luciano also saw the potential in gambling, another area where the mafia had long been involved but had operated in a disjointed, inefficient way. From illegal casinos to numbers rackets, gambling was a highly profitable enterprise, but it was also a business fraught with competition and instability. Luciano's genius was in recognizing the need for consolidation in the gambling world as well. He worked to establish control over the various gambling operations in New York City, unifying them under a single banner. This allowed him to standardize the operations, streamline profits, and reduce the risk of competition among different mafia families. By creating a monopoly on illegal gambling, Luciano not only maximized profits but also ensured that his organization would remain the dominant force in New York's underground economy. Luciano's approach to the business of crime went beyond bootlegging and gambling. He also sought to control the labor unions, which were a key part of the mafia's operations. Unions, particularly in the construction and waterfront industries, were highly lucrative targets for criminal enterprises. Through his strategic alliances and his careful cultivation of relationships with union leaders, Luciano was able to gain control over the most profitable unions in the city. This allowed him to extort businesses, manipulate labor disputes, and skim profits from construction projects and shipping operations. Like his other criminal enterprises, Luciano ran the unions like a business, ensuring that he controlled the flow of money and maintained a tight grip on the operations. The unions became yet another stream of income for Luciano's growing criminal empire. What made Luciano's approach so revolutionary was his ability to run these operations like a corporation. Each of his criminal ventures was structured with a clear hierarchy and division of labor, just as if he were managing a legitimate business. He appointed trusted individuals to oversee different aspects of the operations, ensuring that each section of his criminal empire ran efficiently. For example, when it came to bootlegging, Luciano had individuals who specialized in smuggling, others who handled distribution, and others who managed the speakeasies. Each of these individuals was accountable to Luciano or his lieutenants, ensuring that the operation ran smoothly and profits were maximized. Similarly, with gambling, Luciano ensured that the various rackets were not competing with each other but were working in tandem to create a monopoly on the market. But Luciano's brilliance didn't just lie in the organizational structure he created. He was also adept at managing the various interests that came with such a large and diverse criminal empire. He understood that maintaining power meant keeping the various factions within the mafia satisfied while also keeping external forces, such as law enforcement and rival gangs, at bay. Luciano was a master of negotiation, and his ability to strike deals and build alliances was one of the keys to his success. He knew when to offer concessions and when to use force, always with the goal of keeping his empire intact and growing. Luciano's ability to treat crime as a business also extended to his relationship with law enforcement and politicians. He understood that in order to operate with impunity, he needed the right people in his pocket. His influence over local politicians and law enforcement officials allowed him to operate freely, knowing that any threats to his empire could be quickly neutralized. This network of political connections was just another part of his business strategy, ensuring that the mafia's operations would remain untouchable. Perhaps Luciano's most significant innovation was the creation of the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the operations of the mafia in the United States. The Commission was made up of representatives from the major mafia families, and it served as a forum for resolving disputes, allocating territories, and managing the various criminal enterprises. By creating the Commission, Luciano established a centralized body that could regulate the activities of the mafia and ensure that the different factions operated in harmony with one another. This was the ultimate manifestation of Luciano's business-minded approach to crime, a structured, organized, and controlled system that eliminated the chaos and disunity that had plagued the mafia in the past. The Commission, under Luciano's leadership, allowed the mafia to operate with unprecedented efficiency. The once fragmented families now worked together, each with their own area of expertise but all contributing to the larger goal of maintaining and expanding the mafia's power. This cooperation between the families was key to Luciano's ability to consolidate his hold over the criminal underworld, and it allowed him to expand his influence across the United States. What had once been a chaotic and disorganized world of street gangs had now become a well-structured and highly profitable criminal empire. Luciano's ability to see crime as a business, to treat it with the same level of precision and organization as a legitimate enterprise, set him apart from other mafia bosses of his time. He was not content to run small-time operations or to rely on the whims of chance. Instead, he sought to build an empire, a criminal empire that would dominate the underworld and ensure his place as its undisputed leader. Through his innovation, his organizational genius, and his ruthless ambition, Luciano turned the business of crime into a highly profitable, well-structured enterprise that was unmatched in its scope and power. His criminal empire would stand as a testament to his vision and his ability to turn the world of crime into a true business. In the world of organized crime, alliances and enemies are often a matter of survival. The very nature of the mafia ensures that the line between friend and foe is never clear-cut, and loyalty can shift in an instant. For Lucky Luciano, the creation and expansion of his empire was as much about forging relationships as it was about dismantling rivals. The underworld, by its very nature, is a fluid and dangerous place where power is never guaranteed, and betrayal is often just around the corner. Luciano was a master of both alliance building and enemy management, understanding that the key to his dominance lay in his ability to navigate this complex web of allegiances and enmities. His relationships with other mobsters, politicians, law enforcement, and even the public would shape not only the future of his empire but the very trajectory of the mafia in America. When Luciano first entered the world of organized crime, he was a young man with little more than ambition and a sharp mind. He quickly realized, however, that to rise above the chaos of New York's underworld, he needed allies, powerful, influential figures who could help him climb the ranks and solidify his position. His first significant ally was Arnold Rothstein, a notorious gambler and fixer who was one of the most influential figures in the city's criminal world. Rothstein was the one who introduced Luciano to the idea that crime, like business, needed to be organized. Under Rothstein's mentorship, Luciano learned the importance of strategy, negotiation, and subtlety in building relationships. Rothstein was a figure of immense respect within the mafia, and his endorsement was invaluable to Luciano's rise. However, the world of organized crime is never static, and the alliances that Luciano formed with men like Rothstein were not guaranteed to last forever. While Rothstein's influence over Luciano was pivotal in his early years, the power dynamics in the mafia were always shifting. Rothstein's eventual downfall, brought about by his own gambling debts, served as a harsh reminder of the fragility of even the most powerful alliances. Rothstein's death in 1928 marked the end of an era, and Luciano quickly realized that the path to power required more than just strategic alliances. It required the ability to adapt, to form new relationships when necessary, and to sever ties with those who could no longer serve his interests. This adaptability became one of Luciano's greatest strengths. As he began to rise in power, he cultivated relationships with key figures in several of the mafia families, particularly the Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese families. These relationships, though often formed out of necessity, were based on mutual respect and shared ambition. Luciano understood that the key to success was not just in controlling territory, but in managing the interests of others. Through these alliances, Luciano was able to consolidate power, ensuring that the different families could cooperate rather than engage in endless, self-destructive conflict. His role as a mediator and unifier within the mafia was crucial to his success. He was the man who could bring the various factions together, a rare skill in a world where betrayal was often just as common as loyalty. However, even as Luciano expanded his influence through alliances, he was also building a network of enemies. In the cutthroat world of the mafia, making enemies was inevitable. Luciano's rise to power came at the expense of others, and there were many who resented his ambition and the way he reshaped the underworld. One of his most significant enemies was Salvatore Maranzano, the head of one of the most powerful mafia families in New York. Maranzano, a traditionalist, believed in maintaining the old ways of the mafia, the chaotic, decentralized system that had existed for years. Luciano, on the other hand, believed that in order for the mafia to thrive, it needed to be modernized and streamlined. He saw Maranzano as a relic of the past, someone who was standing in the way of progress. The rivalry between Luciano and Maranzano culminated in a bloody power struggle known as the Castellamarese War, which would become a defining moment in Luciano's life. The war was a brutal, all-out conflict between the forces loyal to Luciano and those loyal to Maranzano. It was a clash of visions for the future of the mafia, with Luciano seeking to bring about change and Maranzano determined to preserve the old ways. The battle for dominance was not just a matter of personal ambition. It was a fight for the very future of the criminal empire that Luciano was trying to build. The war was bloody and it claimed many lives, including Maranzano's. The conflict ended with Maranzano's assassination in 1931, and Luciano emerged as the undisputed leader of New York's underworld. His victory in the Castellamarese War marked the beginning of a new era for the mafia, one where power was centralized, and the various families could work together under a unified structure. With Maranzano dead, Luciano's influence grew exponentially, and he was able to cement his control over the mafia. His victory in the war also solidified his reputation as a man who could not only make powerful allies but also eliminate his enemies with ruthless efficiency. Luciano's ability to outmaneuver his rivals, to neutralize them when necessary, was one of the key factors that set him apart from other mafia bosses. He was not content to simply play by the rules. He was willing to break the rules even to the point of murder in order to secure his position. This willingness to do whatever it took to maintain power made him a formidable adversary and ensured that his influence would continue to grow. However, Luciano's relationship with his enemies was not always one of direct conflict. He was also a master of diplomacy, and his ability to negotiate with his rivals was a crucial part of his strategy. He knew that to maintain his position he needed to keep the peace with other powerful figures in the mafia. In the years following the Castellamarese War, Luciano formed a series of alliances with other mafia bosses, many of whom had once been his enemies. He understood that cooperation rather than constant infighting was the key to maintaining control over the underworld. Through the creation of the Commission, Luciano established a governing body that would oversee the operations of all the mafia families in the United States. The Commission was designed to ensure that the families would work together, rather than against each other, and to prevent the kind of destructive power struggles that had characterized the past. While Luciano was able to manage the external threats to his power, he was not immune to betrayal from within his own ranks. The mafia is a world where loyalty is always in question, and even the most trusted allies can turn against you if it serves their interests. Luciano had to navigate the delicate balance of keeping his closest allies satisfied while also ensuring that potential rivals were kept in check. At times, this meant making difficult decisions, even turning against those who had once been his closest friends. One such example was his falling out with his former ally, Vito Genovese. Genovese had been one of Luciano's most trusted lieutenants, and together, they had played a pivotal role in the rise of the mafia. However, Genovese's ambition eventually led to a rift between the two men. In the early 1930s, Genovese attempted to have Luciano murdered in a bid to take control of the family. Luciano's ability to survive this betrayal and maintain his power is a testament to his cunning and ability to outthink his enemies. Despite the attempt on his life, Luciano was able to neutralize Genovese's threat and remain at the helm of the mafia. Luciano's enemies were not limited to rival gangsters. He also had to contend with the government. The law enforcement and political establishments were constantly looking for ways to take him down, and Luciano's empire was under constant threat of exposure. However, Luciano's relationship with law enforcement was often one of pragmatic cooperation. He understood that to operate with impunity, he needed to have influence within the political and legal systems. He used bribery, blackmail, and manipulation to ensure that his operations were shielded from the authorities. In fact, his political connections were one of the key reasons he was able to maintain such a long reign at the top. However, Luciano also understood that this relationship was fragile. As the pressure from law enforcement increased, he would eventually be arrested and convicted of crimes that would lead to his deportation. But even in the face of legal challenges, Luciano's ability to adapt and find new ways to maintain his influence allowed him to survive in a world that was constantly shifting. The alliances and enemies that Luciano cultivated throughout his life were integral to his success. He was a man who knew how to make friends, how to manipulate those around him, and how to destroy his rivals when necessary. His understanding of power dynamics and his ability to play both sides, ally and enemy, allowed him to build an empire that would stand as one of the most formidable criminal organizations in history. His legacy is a testament to his ability to navigate the ever-shifting terrain of the underworld, balancing alliances with rivals, and always ensuring that he remained on top. The life of Lucky Luciano was one marked by a series of pivotal moments, each shaped by conflict, strategy, and survival. One of the most defining elements of his story was the hidden, often brutal, war that played out within the underworld and between him and his enemies. This hidden war was not fought with public declarations or gunfire in the streets but through manipulation, power struggles, and careful covert moves that shaped the entire trajectory of Luciano's rise to power. In an empire built on loyalty, fear, and ambition, Luciano's ability to navigate a world of constant tension and violent rivalries ensured not only his survival but his ultimate domination of the mafia. The underworld in which Luciano operated was, by nature, unstable. The power dynamics among the various mafia families were ever-shifting, and the lines between allies and enemies were blurred. For much of the time, Luciano's strategy involved striking the right balance between forging temporary alliances with one faction while preparing to outmaneuver them should the situation demand it. This was not just a matter of rivalry but a battle for control over the sprawling and lucrative criminal enterprises that made up the backbone of the mafia's wealth: bootlegging, gambling, labor racketeering, and more. One of the most significant and dramatic conflicts that would come to define Luciano's rule was his bitter struggle with Salvatore Maranzano, one of the leading figures in the mafia at the time. Maranzano was an old-school boss, deeply entrenched in traditional mafia values. He believed in an archaic, fragmented system where each family operated independently, and loyalty to the old ways was paramount. But Luciano, who was more visionary and forward-thinking, understood that for the mafia to survive and thrive, it needed to evolve. He wanted to create an organized, centralized structure where families could cooperate and share profits, not constantly battle for territory and power. Maranzano, on the other hand, saw Luciano's ideas as a threat to the established order and began to target him. This would set off a conflict that would culminate in what became known as the Castellammarese War. The Castellammarese War was not a war fought on the front lines but a battle for ideological control over the mafia itself. It was a bloody, covert struggle between Luciano's supporters and Maranzano's men, carried out through intimidation, assassination attempts, and manipulation. Luciano was fighting for a new world order, one where power was centralized and organized, while Maranzano fought to keep the mafia in its traditional, chaotic state. The war was a turning point for Luciano, as it tested his ability to handle threats, both within the organization and from rival factions. But Luciano was not only a street-smart thug, he was a strategist. He knew that the key to winning this war was not just through force, but through intelligence, timing, and manipulation of the existing power structures. The war finally came to a head in 1931, when Luciano made the bold move to eliminate Maranzano. In a meticulously planned hit, Luciano's men executed Maranzano, sending shockwaves through the mafia. The death of Maranzano was the final blow in the war, and it marked the beginning of a new era for the underworld. Luciano emerged from the conflict as the undisputed leader of New York's mafia families, but his victory was bittersweet. The war had left scars on the organization, and while Luciano had won the battle, the war was far from over. The aftermath of the Castellamarese War created a power vacuum, and rival factions scrambled to fill the void. Luciano would now have to fight an entirely new kind of battle. One not against rivals like Maranzano but against the constant threats of betrayal, shifting allegiances, and external pressures from law enforcement. Luciano's ability to navigate this new phase of power struggles was central to his rise. Unlike many of the other mob bosses, Luciano understood that war was not just about physical dominance. It was about controlling the flow of information, manipulating the right people, and ensuring that his organization remained unified even as it expanded. After Maranzano's death, Luciano wasted little time in consolidating his power, and he quickly set about reorganizing the mafia's operations. He established the Commission, a governing body that would oversee the activities of all the mafia families across the country. This was a stroke of genius, as it created a unified structure that allowed the different families to work together rather than against each other. The Commission also acted as a forum for resolving disputes and maintaining peace within the mafia. Luciano's ability to forge this kind of cooperation in an environment where betrayal was the norm was a testament to his political savvy and his ability to manipulate the dynamics of power. But despite the creation of the Commission, the hidden war never truly ended. The struggle for control over various criminal enterprises continued behind the scenes. Luciano was constantly forced to navigate delicate political waters, both within the mafia and in the outside world. One of the key strategies he employed was the use of intermediaries. By placing trusted lieutenants in positions of power and authority, Luciano was able to distance himself from the day-to-day operations of the mafia, allowing him to operate in the shadows while still maintaining control over the entire organization. This strategy helped him stay one step ahead of both rival mobsters and law enforcement, ensuring that his enemies could never quite pin him down. However, Luciano was not immune to the dangers of the underworld, and even as he built his empire, the pressure on him increased. The federal government in particular became a growing threat. The era of prohibition had provided the mafia with vast opportunities for wealth, but it also attracted the attention of law enforcement. As the government intensified its efforts to crack down on organized crime, Luciano found himself increasingly at odds with the authorities. He had always been adept at managing his relationships with politicians and law enforcement, using bribes and influence to protect his empire, but the rising pressure from the government made it clear that Luciano's time as a free man was running out. In the early 1930s, the federal government launched a major crackdown on organized crime, and Luciano became one of the primary targets. It was during this time that the hidden war took on a new dimension. Now, it was not only about dealing with rivals within the mafia but also about protecting his empire from the growing threat of the law. Luciano's ability to manage this dual threat, the constant danger posed by internal enemies and the external pressures of law enforcement, became a defining characteristic of his reign. He was able to avoid conviction for years, relying on his ability to stay out of the public eye, manipulating the legal system, and using his vast network of allies to protect his interests. But eventually Luciano's luck ran out. In 1936 he was arrested on charges of operating a massive prostitution ring, a case that had been building for years. Despite his best efforts to maintain his control over the organization, the government was able to use his criminal activities as leverage to secure his conviction. Luciano was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a crushing blow to his empire. But even in prison, Luciano continued to exert influence over the mafia. His ability to control the underworld from behind bars was a testament to his genius as a strategist. The hidden war may have been over, but Luciano's fight for dominance and survival continued in a new form, one that would ultimately lead to his deportation and exile. Luciano's ability to survive in the face of so many external and internal threats speaks to his resilience and adaptability. His hidden war was not just a battle for power, but a constant struggle to remain relevant and maintain control in a world that was changing rapidly. Even as his empire was dismantled and his influence began to wane, Luciano's strategic mind and understanding of the underworld ensured that his legacy would continue to shape the mafia for decades to come. The hidden war, though fought in the shadows, defined Luciano's rise to power and ultimately his downfall. His life was a testament to the volatile, ever-shifting nature of the criminal world, where victory was never guaranteed and survival depended on the ability to adapt to an ever-changing environment. The fall of Lucky Luciano was not a single moment in time but rather the culmination of a series of events that, over the years, slowly chipped away at the foundations of his empire. It was a fall that was both inevitable and a product of his own ambition, a bitter irony for a man who had spent much of his life outsmarting his enemies and controlling his destiny. His arrest in 1936, following an extensive investigation into his criminal activities, was a defining moment in this decline. But it wasn't just his downfall that marked the end of an era. The fall of Luciano was also a reflection of the changing tides in the world of organized crime, the ever-tightening grip of law enforcement, and the internal strife that was slowly fracturing the empire he had so carefully built. Luciano's fall was the result of a combination of external pressures, the shifting dynamics within the mafia, and the culmination of years of rising legal and political scrutiny. At the core of Luciano's downfall was his inability to remain immune to the law forever. For years he had operated with relative impunity, his criminal empire largely shielded by a network of loyal lieutenants, politicians and law enforcement officials who were either on his payroll or in his debt. His brilliance lay not just in his criminal enterprises but in his ability to create an intricate web of protection, a system where money, influence and fear worked together to protect him from the law. However, the era of prohibition had left a legacy of widespread corruption, and as the federal government grew more determined to crack down on organized crime, the walls that Luciano had so carefully built began to crumble. In 1931, as Luciano was firmly at the height of his power, the federal authorities began targeting him with increasing ferocity, and the day would come when even his vast network of influence would not be enough to shield him. His arrest on charges of running a nationwide prostitution ring in 1936 was the result of years of investigations and pressure from federal authorities. Although Luciano had managed to evade conviction for a long time, the authorities' persistence, coupled with his growing influence in illegal gambling and labor racketeering, made him an irresistible target. The case against him was built on extensive surveillance, wiretaps and undercover operations, all of which painted a damning portrait of Luciano as the mastermind behind an elaborate criminal empire that spanned the nation. For all his genius in running criminal enterprises like bootlegging and gambling, Luciano was ultimately undone by his own success. The more he expanded, the more he became a visible target, and the law finally managed to gather enough evidence to bring him to trial. Luciano's trial in 1936 was a spectacle that captivated the nation. The media frenzy that surrounded the trial only added to the public's fascination with his story. The world watched as one of the most powerful men in the country was paraded through the court system, his once invincible empire now under siege by the very system he had spent years evading. Luciano's trial was a moment of reckoning, and as the evidence mounted against him, it became clear that he would not escape this time. His charm, his power, and his influence could no longer protect him from the consequences of his actions. The prosecutor's case was airtight, and despite his legal team's best efforts, Luciano was convicted on charges of compulsory prostitution, which carried a lengthy prison sentence. The conviction marked the beginning of the end for Luciano's reign. He was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison, a harsh blow that not only stripped him of his freedom but also shattered the delicate balance of power that he had spent decades constructing. The loss of his position as the head of the mafia left a void, one that quickly sparked power struggles and infighting within the ranks. While Luciano had created a system of cooperation among the various mafia families through the creation of the commission, his absence as the central figure meant that rival factions began to jockey for position, each family trying to gain dominance in the wake of his imprisonment. The commission itself, once a symbol of unity, was now at risk of fracturing as ambitious mobsters sought to expand their territory at any cost. In prison, Luciano's influence was not immediately diminished, but it was undeniably limited. His ability to make decisions and control operations from behind bars was a testament to his enduring cunning and strategic mind, but the reality of his situation was undeniable. The man who had once been a free, powerful figure who moved through the world with unmatched authority was now confined to a prison cell, forced to rely on intermediaries to carry out his orders. The prison itself became a symbol of the reality of Luciano's fall. Though he was still able to maintain connections with his men on the outside, he was no longer in the position of direct control that he had once enjoyed. Luciano's time in prison marked the beginning of a long, drawn-out battle for his survival. While his empire was in disarray, he did not give up without a fight. He worked tirelessly to maintain his influence, using his connections in the legal and political systems to orchestrate his release. Luciano's mind was never idle, and he understood that his time in prison could not last forever. His ultimate goal, however, was not simply to regain his freedom but to reassert his dominance over the mafia. He knew that if he could get out of prison he could rebuild his empire and return to the helm of the criminal world. But the authorities, aware of his influence and power, had other plans.
In 1946, after serving just over 10 years of his sentence, Luciano was granted a conditional release. His extradition was facilitated by the U.S. government in exchange for his help in establishing cooperation between the mafia and U.S. intelligence agencies during World War II. It was a controversial decision, one that raised questions about the government's willingness to work with criminals in the interest of national security. But for Luciano, this was his chance at a comeback. He was deported to Italy, a country that he had once controlled in part, and he was determined to rebuild his network of criminal enterprises from the ground up. However, the world had changed since his imprisonment. The political and criminal landscape in Italy was vastly different from what it had been when Luciano was at the height of his power. His influence in the mafia was no longer what it once was, and the political shifts in both the United States and Italy meant that his reign was essentially over. Luciano, now a man in his mid-50s, was no longer the young, ambitious street kid who had risen to dominate the underworld. The world around him had moved on, and despite his best efforts, he found it increasingly difficult to regain the control he once had. Luciano's time in Italy was marked by a sense of reflection and regret. Though he had once been a visionary, building the mafia into a global criminal empire, his later years were marked by a kind of philosophical transformation. He had spent much of his life navigating the violent and cutthroat world of organized crime, and now, in exile, he was forced to confront the reality of his decisions. His health deteriorated, and he began to grapple with the choices that had brought him to this point. The man who had once been feared and revered as a master strategist was now a figure who existed in the shadows of a world that had moved on without him. Luciano's final years were a quiet decline, far removed from the powerful figure he had once been. He spent his last years in Naples, where he continued to try to maintain his connections with old allies, but he was no longer the man who could dictate the course of events. His influence, both in the mafia and in the criminal world at large, had waned. Luciano died in 1962 at the age of 64 of a heart attack. His death, though relatively quiet, marked the final end of an era. Luciano had been the man who built the modern mafia, but by the time of his death, his empire was nothing more than a memory. The fall of Lucky Luciano was a complex and multifaceted process. It was not just the result of a single defeat or a moment of weakness, but a gradual erosion of power, a result of the shifting tides of both law and loyalty. His empire had been built on cunning, manipulation, and ruthlessness, but in the end, it was his inability to adapt to the changing world around him that led to his downfall. Even in exile, he was a man who had lost everything: his power, his influence, and his place in the underworld. His fall was a stark reminder that in the world of organized crime, even the most powerful figures are vulnerable, and no empire, no matter how carefully constructed, is immune to collapse. The trial of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was a defining moment in the history of organized crime. It marked not just the downfall of one of the most powerful and influential figures in the mafia, but also represented a watershed moment in the legal and political battles between the criminal underworld and the government. For years, Luciano had managed to operate with a level of invincibility, skillfully navigating the complex networks of law enforcement, politics, and rival families that kept the mafia's world intact. But by the time the trial began, the weight of his empire, his actions, and the ever-increasing pressure from law enforcement had finally caught up with him. Before his trial, Luciano had faced numerous investigations, but he had always managed to outmaneuver, or outlast his enemies. His ability to control the underworld while evading the law was a testament to his sharp mind and strategic genius. Yet, the charges against him in 1936, primarily linked to his role in running one of the largest and most sophisticated prostitution rings in the country, represented the culmination of years of covert investigations by the federal government. His arrest was a monumental event, and it set the stage for a dramatic legal battle that would shake the foundations of the criminal world. Luciano's trial was much more than just a courtroom spectacle. It was a battle for the future of his empire. If he lost, it would not only mean years behind bars, but also a permanent loss of power. The trial would send a message to the mafia and to the public that even someone as powerful and influential as Luciano could be brought to justice. But Luciano, ever the tactician, wasn't about to go down without a fight. His defense team was formidable, and his trial would be a test of his ability to manipulate the system from within, just as he had manipulated the criminal world for so many years. In many ways, the trial was his last stand.